certainly don't need to because you will receive a copy of the slides. So before I introduce myself, I'll hand it over to Access to Place, who are our wonderful hosts today, to do a bit of an introduction.
Hello everybody, welcome to today's presentation. My name is Ashley Pike and I am one of the housing officers here at Access to Place. So a little bit about us. The purpose of today's presentation is to share information to ensure the best housing outcomes for people living with disability. So we were established in 2014 by SAHA, the South Australian Government, with the purpose of having an independent non-for-profit disability-specific housing provider. So we provide affordable and accessible homes for people living with disability. We are a registered NDIS provider, so we do have a lot of compliance reporting that we do, and we manage 306 homes with 500 tenancies, and all our tenants are living with disability, and they're range from high needs to intellectual disabilities. So we are very much tenant focused, and we would like basically our tenants, it's their home and we invite the supports to be within their home. So we are the landlords of the property and the tenants are obviously our tenants, and the support providers are invited to give services to the home, and we support the tenants with that.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Ashley. And we'll talk a little bit more about Access to Place at the end of the presentation today. So we've got 2 hours roughly today to get through today's agenda. So I'll quickly run through how we've structured the content today. So we're going to do a basic introduction to SDA and how SDA fits within the broader home and living context within NDIS, because SDA, as you might be aware, is only a relatively small component of the housing available to people that might be NDIS participants. Pardon me. We'll then go into typical SDA relationships. So how does SDA fit in? Who are the people involved and what are the relationships between all of those people? We'll then touch on probably the areas where a lot of people today would be more interested around SDA eligibility. So we'll look at what the legislation and the rules, etc., tell us, and then we'll also have a bit of an insight into what the housing panels within the NDIS look for. And then finally, we'll do a fairly deep dive into housing solution reports and sort of have a look at what content are in those, how that content's structured, and also some sort of tips about what content to use, what content not to use, which can be equally as important. As I mentioned previously, I really do encourage people to participate as much or as little as you're comfortable with doing today. Chat function is working, so please, if you feel, you put questions, observations, etc. in the chat, and then at the end of each one of these content pieces, we'll have a little bit of a pause to make sure and answer any questions that people might have. So before we get into it, I'll just do a brief introduction on myself. My name's Brent. I'm a principal consultant with DSC. I've been with DSC now for coming up on 6 years, and in that time I've worked fairly exclusively across housing and supports for people living independently across all the ranges of housing and support options that there are. So that's me professionally. Personally, I also have a 20-year-old son who has cerebral palsy. He's an NDIS participant and he's actually on a home and living journey as we speak. So I'm heavily invested both personally and professionally in all things home and living in the NDIS. So I thought it useful to start off talking today about what does home and living look like. And this is a very simplified diagram, but I feel it does give a really good picture of home and living in the NDIS. Obviously, there are other components. There's assistive technology, there's house, home mods, etc. But just in its really basic principles, the home, we effectively have two options. We've got specialist disability accommodation, and then we've got everything else. On the living side, it's really emerging as recently as the last 48 hours. There's been some further information released on the SIL side of things, that there really are three main groupings of support options for people wanting to live independently. They are supported independent living, or SIL, individual living options, or ILO, as they're currently referred to. The newcomer, we sort of refer to it as the cool kid on the block, because it very much has the attention of the NDIS at the moment. And then last, but certainly not least, there's flexible core supports, which really picks up people that potentially don't need as much support. And we'll have a bit closer look at those as we go through today. But I just find that diagram really, really useful to actually explain what home and living is within the NDIS construct. So looking at the home in more detail, so obviously SDA housing, all of the information that we've received from the NDIS when it first began is the estimate of around 6% of people that are NDIS eligible will be also eligible for SDA. So it's a really small percentage. It equates to roughly 28,000 people. We're currently sitting around 16,000 people with SDA funding in their plans at the moment. So we do have a way to go in terms of people testing their eligibility for SDA. If you're not one of the lucky 6%, then the remaining 94% of NDIS participants then have to look at mainstream housing options. So there's home ownership, which again, it would be for a lucky few. Cooperative housing, community and social housing, which does tend to be one of the larger areas where people with disability do live. Public housing, private rentals, even a movable unit or bungalow, a granny flat type of approach, supported residential services as they've been referred to in some jurisdictions over the years, and rooming houses also being used to accommodate people with disability. So quite a few options, and obviously today we're all here to talk about SDA. So we're going to be talking about specialist disability accommodation. We won't really be touching on any of the mainstream options in any detail today. So taking a bit more detail into SDA, there's a number of different styles of housing that is eligible to be enrolled as SDA. So there are apartments. So either 1, 2 or 3 bedroom apartments and 1 or 2 tenants. So you can have a 2-bedroom apartment with 2 tenants, or you can have a 3-bedroom apartment with 2 tenants. And when I refer to tenants, I refer to people that are receiving an SDA payment. Obviously, in a 3-bedroom apartment, you could have 2 people receiving an SDA payment, and you could have a 3rd person not receiving an SDA payment. And that's quite possible under the SDA rules. It's also something that we're going to see, I suspect, a lot more of as we move forward into the new support side of the NDIS with things like ILO and flatmates, etc. Have villa, duplex, townhouse, dual keys, all the different names for that style of accommodation. As soon as you move out of apartments, they don't start talking about the total number of bedrooms in residence. They just talk about the number of residents. So in villa, duplex or townhouses, you can have 1, 2 or 3 tenants and OOA. So OOA, on-site overnight assistance. Just circling back to apartments quickly, you can't have apartments in the robust category. That was a decision made by the NDIS right back at design, where they felt that the typical person that would be eligible for robust would struggle to live in that really high density apartment style of accommodation. I'm not here to justify or otherwise the decisions that the NDIS have made, but that's certainly the thinking behind why robust isn't possible in apartments. We then move to houses. So you can have houses with 2 or 3 tenants. Unfortunately, in their wisdom, they didn't do a sole occupancy house as one of the options, which again, if you're in the robust space, you'd understand that that doesn't make a lot of sense. On-site overnight accommodation, again, in the different housing styles. And then finally, group homes, which are 4 or 5 people. And again, with on-site overnight assistance. If you've been keeping track of everything happening in home and living, you may have seen the home and living consultation paper that was released in June. It made a statement in there that in the future, the NDIS may not fund even 5-person group homes. It didn't give a timeline, but it made that statement, which I found quite interesting. So the style, what determines whether it's an apartment, a townhouse, a house, et cetera, it comes back to the National Construction Code. There's a definition of different types of dwellings, et cetera, in there. And then obviously any state building requirements as well get overlaid on that. So they're the different sort of physical presentation of the different styles of housing that can be considered for SDA. Across all of those different styles, except robust in apartments, you have the opportunity to have 4 different accessibility levels. So you can have a 2-bedroom house that can be any one of these accessibility levels. And so we'll have a quick look at what they might be. So improved livability. Think of improved livability as sort of the base level accessible home. It doesn't have a huge amount of technology. It doesn't have a huge amount of disability specific features in it. It's more of a universally designed home. Typically, a person that might have sensory, intellectual or cognitive impairment is the type of person that we're seeing being found eligible for improved livability SDA. Also, it's sort of acting as a bit of a catch-all for people that may not fit comfortably in the other 3 areas. We're finding that some people are then just being found eligible for that style, almost by default. We then move to fully accessible. So fully accessible is when you start moving into greater dimensions, more circulation space, wider doorways, less thresholds, et cetera, et cetera. So it starts looking a little bit more like a really accessible home. If it's designed and built well, it doesn't look any different to anyone else's home apart from slightly wider hallways, doorways, et cetera. I've been to well over 300 different SDA homes around Australia over the last 5 years. And if they're done well, you walk in and you get that sense of, wow, I'd love to live here because it's just a really nice, spacious home. Moving from fully accessible to high physical support, the dimensions don't change. Dimensionally, they can be the same. High physical support has a lot more technology and a lot more provision for disability specific supports in the future if the person requires them. So that might be reinforcement in the ceilings to allow for ceiling hoists, allowance for plugging in uninterrupted power supplies if there's life critical equipment that needs to be able to operate if there is a power outage. Typically has a lot more assistive technology, so a lot more automation, doors, blinds, climate, lights, security, access, all of those things potentially being automated. So that's a bit of a trap because people often think between fully accessible and high physical support, there's this huge amount of change in the actual dwelling itself, and there isn't. The real difference is the technology and the smarts, basically, in the high physical support. And then finally, we've got robust. So robust in dimensionally is very similar to improved livability. So it doesn't necessarily have the wider hallways and doorways, et cetera, although it can. Typically, it has more resilience built into it. So you might, instead of having your old typical plaster on the walls inside, it might have MDF or some other more resilient. In really extreme cases, you might find that the windows are either city glass, they might be double or triple glazed, they might be perspex even. They might go to the extreme of having recessed and hidden light switches, auto shut-off valves for taps, lockable kitchens, etc. So there's a whole range of different design options in robust. It's probably...
Can I just point out that Access to Place are looking at these options for their tenants, and this is something that we would like to be involved with a little bit more, given that we have had a lot of interest in robust housing.
Great, thanks. So with robust, if you are, or you sort of educating yourself around SDA at the moment, and you've looked at the design guidelines or the design standards, I should say, you'll see that robust isn't very well specified in the current design standards for SDA. And that's why it's really important to find organisations such as Access to Place that are gathering that knowledge in terms of what really good, robust design looks like. In my mind, it's definitely the one category of SDA where co-design is so important to make sure that the physical environment is designed to interact with the person or persons that might be living there to ensure that the need for supports is actually reduced. So we've got different styles, we've got different accessibility levels, and then finally, there's a couple of other categories, and these categories were invented at the start of the scheme to enable all of the stock that was currently being used around Australia for disability housing to remain in the scheme. There was a real fear that people might exit the scheme with their properties, which would compound an already dire problem for access to housing for people with disability. So we've got new stock, which is brand new purpose-built SDA housing. And to fit the new stock criteria, it must have received its occupancy certificate or its completion certificate after the 1st of April 2016. You can also refurbish existing disability housing and get it up to a new SDA standard. There is a big if with that, because the actual costs that you need to spend on that refurbishment are extreme. To give you an example, to refurbish an existing 5-person group home, to get it up to a new stock level high physical support group home, the minimum spend that the NDIS requires you to provide evidence of is over $750,000. So in a lot of cases, they have set those prices such to discourage people from renovation. I think they haven't come out and said it in black and white, but it's definitely their preference that if there are providers that have older housing stock, they would prefer that they knock them down and rebuild. That's the message that is being sent by some of those ridiculously high thresholds. As I mentioned, there's existing stock. So anything that received its occupancy certificate before the 1st of April 2016, and there's 2 other things it must satisfy. It must have previously been used by some form of state or territory funded disability scheme in a period of time that spans back to about 2012. So there's a window of time there that it must have been used previously as housing for a person with disability. What that is intended to do is to stop a person just going out and buying any old property, doing a little bit of work to it, and then trying to register it as existing SDA stock. So that's the reason they've done that. Existing stock can be across all of those accessibility levels that I mentioned. There is also one other category that they designed purely for existing stock, and it's known as basic. What basic means is it doesn't really satisfy any of the new SDA design requirements, but we acknowledge the fact that it has been used to accommodate people with disability, and we want to keep it for now being used to accommodate people with disability. So they created that basic stock category only for existing disability housing. And finally, legacy stock, which is for settings with 6 or more people. They're currently, so if you had legacy settings greater than 10 people, the funding for those settings runs out very soon. If you have legacy stock between 6 and 10 people, the funding for it runs out in just over 5 years' time. The legacy housing payments are very small, somewhere around $2,000 on average per person per annum. So they're a very, very small payment when compared to all the other SDA payments that are possible. So hopefully you're sticking with me. Think of it as a big matrix, different styles of properties, different accessibility levels, and then different timelines, whether it's new or whether it's existing. So there's fairly complicated already, but hopefully that's made some sense of the different options for SDA. So I thought it'd be useful just to quickly touch on what the SDA current status is in South Australia. Now, this is based on data that came out of the recent quarterly report. So this is current as of 30 September. So it's pretty current.
Rachel call.
Sorry? That's all good. It's great being the host. You've got power to mute people. Okay, so what's happening with SDA in South Australia at the moment? So as of 30 September, 1,700 people had an SDA payment in their plan, which you think, well, that's pretty good, but only 20.5 million committed. So if you do the math and divide 20 million by 1,700 people, it's not a huge amount on average per person of SDA funding. So what that generally tells us is that the vast majority of people with SDA funding in South Australia have funding to live in existing stock. And we'll park that for a second and we'll have a look at how much new SDA there is in a minute. There's 2,377 people have a SIL payment in their plan, and look at that number compared to the SDA, 808 million committed in SIL funding. So I use these numbers quite a bit when I get angry with the NDIS about eligibility, outcomes, etc. And they hide behind the context of, not wanting to set up a financial commitment into the future for the NDIS that might not be reasonable and necessary. When you compare 20 million with 808 million, it's just a non-argument in my mind. So huge discrepancies there. 29 active SDA providers, which is a really small number. Access to Place would be one of the bigger active SDA providers in South Australia. So it's just more important to find not only SDA providers that are active, but ones that are also actually have the experience. It's very important. Excuse me for a second. Okay, so that's the people side of it. There's 1,171 dwellings currently enrolled as SDA in South Australia. I usually find people start seeing these numbers and go, wow, that's actually a really big number. I didn't realise there was 1,171 homes in South Australia registered as SDA. However, of those homes, there's 969 of them are existing. So a huge number of the SDA homes available in South Australia are existing SDA. And that means pre-April 2016, that could go back 50 years. So there's no sort of age limit, if you like, on those properties. Looking a little bit further and looking at the different categories that these properties fit in, 566. So roughly half of the current homes are basic. And what that means is they don't meet any form of the new SDA design requirements. 248 improved livability, 203 high physical support, 55 robust. Now, robust being the smaller number is exactly the same in every jurisdiction around Australia at the moment, but South Australia actually have a larger number of robust homes if you compare by population. So you're actually ahead of the curve in the robust compared with most other jurisdictions in Australia. And then finally, 99 dwellings that are enrolled as fully accessible. Pardon me, we also recently, the NDIS has started providing us, pardon me, with pipeline information, which means a dwelling that is committed to be built. So it could be a vacant block of land where they're about to start building, or it could be a property that is about to be finished. So it's in that sort of spectrum of construction. There's 125 dwellings in South Australia currently recorded in the supply pipeline. So that's a relatively high number. That's almost 10% of the existing dwellings being delivered in, you'd say, over the next 12 months. All of those properties would be completed. We also recently got some more data from the NDIS around the number of people that are in SDA or are seeking SDA. So basically think of this as people that have an SDA payment approved in their plan. They're either living in some form of SDA now and would like to relocate, or they're living not in SDA. So it could be residential aged care, hospital, home with mum and dad, some other form of accommodation, and they would like to find a new SDA option. So we've got 119 people wanting to relocate out of SDA, and we have 244 people seeking a new SDA outcome as of the 30th September. So it's quite reasonable numbers. And those numbers have grown quite considerably over the last 12 months. So we're definitely seeing more people starting to test their eligibility and wanting to go on an SDA journey. If you do want to look at the data in more detail, South Australia is broken down both by NDIS service district, but then they also break it down by statistical area 4 and statistical area 3. Difference being a statistical area 3 is a group of population of around 30,000 to 100,000 people. So that's how the Australian Bureau of Statistics sort of break up the country into different sets of population. So there's a lot of data available if you do want to go in and look at it in more detail. So we've spoken about the SDA side of things. What's becoming really evident over the journey of the NDIS so far is you can't just look at the housing in isolation. You've got to also consider the type of supports that are going to be delivered in that housing for a whole number of reasons. For the reasons of making sure that the housing actually supports the type of support that the person would like to receive, but also making sure that overall, holistically, when you put the home and living solution together for people, that it's not totaling up to a huge sum of money. Because as you're probably all aware, there's been fairly significant downward pressure, especially on SIL funding over the last 18 months. So always having to keep an eye on the total picture for a housing, home and living outcome is really, really important. So options for supports in SDA and options for supports in any form of disability housing. I liken it as a bit of a continuum of different types of supports, and it's determined by the number of hours a person needs paid support. It's the flexible core support. So it's typically a person that's relatively independent, can live in the community independently, but might need some sort of drop-in support or limited amount of support just to make sure everything's okay, help them with some problem solving, help them with a few things around the home, etc. But generally a person that is relatively independent. There's no time requirement on that, but if you go to the individual living option operational guideline, it starts specifying some times. So in ILO, it basically talks about a person that has a minimum requirement of 6 hours of support a day is sort of the entry threshold for ILO. So to me, that straight away says, right, 0 to 6 is flexible core, 6, you start looking at ILO, and then as you push up to 24 hours of support a day, that's when you start potentially transitioning. Now, in an ILO model, it is possible to have 24/7 support. It's just not all paid. It's not the traditional pay a support worker an hourly rate to provide the support. There's all sorts of other models of flatmates and families and neighbours and so on, and I won't go into that. I could speak about that for the next 2 days about how ILO works. And then finally, we have SIL. And again, if you've been keeping track of all the changes in SIL, you may have seen that there were 2 new operational guidelines for SIL dropped this week. One very much participant focused and one provider focused. Those new operational guidelines have made it really clear that SIL is considered for 24/7 paid supports in a shared living environment. Shared environment comes up through the new operational guidelines quite a number of times. And if you've been aware of the downward pressure on SIL funding over the last 18 months, you'd be aware that the levels that SIL funding is being pushed down to makes it very difficult for the vast majority of people to actually afford one-on-one 24/7 support. The sort of numbers we're typically seeing is sort of mid 200,000 seems to be where a lot of SIL funding is being pushed down to. And we've heard absolute horror stories, which I'm sure you all have as well, in terms of how some of that SIL funding has been reduced just with no reference, no empathy towards the person, just bang, it's reduced. So again, that's something else I could rant about for hours. but we're here to talk about SDA. So talking about looking at the home, looking at the supports, I think it's important just to touch on all of the information that we're receiving out of the NDIS, all the signals, some direct, some not so direct. But what they're definitely pushing towards are really contemporary housing and support options as we move into the future. So some of the language that they're using in their consultation papers, operational guidelines now, etc., is around enhancing participant choice and control, enabling a person to choose where they live, who they live with, who provides their support, etc., which is all wonderful words. Whether they actually do that in practice is a completely different story. Separation of housing and support. Now, this is a big consideration. When the scheme was first designed, the language around separation of housing was actually firmer than it is today. It started off saying that the agency has a preference that housing and support are provided separately or in a situation where they can be separable at some point in the future. As the scheme progressed, that language kind of got watered down. We thought that the quality and safeguarding framework could be the next point in time when they introduced a hard separation between home and living, and it wasn't. There was a conflict of interest policy put in place, or a requirement for conflict of interest, but that's sort of where it stopped. I have a very strong suspicion in the next 12 months we might see the NDIS take a more firm position on separation. They might set a couple of dates in the future and say by this date there cannot be a new home and living solution created where support and home is being provided by the one organisation. That might be 1 year in the future. There might be another date, 5 years, that sort of time frame in the future where they say if you are currently doing it now, you have to decouple it by that date. Otherwise, you won't be funded in the future. That's just my prediction of what we might see in terms of separation. It's a lot of language around strengthening informal connections, meaningful relationships, building support works, maintaining informal supports. Maintaining informal supports is mentioned in the new SIL operational guideline for the first time. It has never been in the SIL operational guidelines where they acknowledge that informal supports can have a role to play in the roster of care, effectively. So again, it's another way that the agency are trying to reduce that funding commitment. Talking about targeted strategies to build and use that informal support to reduce the need for 24/7 support, as I just said. Looking at alternative ways of paying for supports, in-kind relationships, flatmates, host families, a lot of the things that are mentioned in the ILO models. One of the outcomes of that is the increase in the safeguarding, because obviously if you do have more sort of contemporary models where you've got a lot more people coming and going and taking a part in providing support for that person in their life, that just naturally enhances the safeguards because you've got more sets of eyes on that person. And then finally, the NDIS is boldly saying that it's going to increase the possibility to access mainstream housing options, making sharing arrangements more affordable and open up more options. Apart from that statement, they don't offer any other solutions to the housing crisis that we currently have. So I think we just park that one for now. Before I get off this first section, I did just want to touch on, I mentioned before the consultation paper, and I also mentioned about the new SIL operational guidelines that came out this week. That process chart that you can see there came out of the consultation paper earlier this year, and we're actually now starting to see this process being used. So as I assume the majority of people with us today are support coordinators, this process, basically the change in process means that a person fills out that request for home and living supports request form, has a planning meeting, gets some funding for exploration and design, potentially also some funding to explore SDA eligibility. All that work is being done, looking at how that person wants to live, who they want to live with, how they're going to be supported, etc. Putting all that information back to the NDIS to get the tick, and then implementing what you designed during that process. It's not until that very last stage in this process that they're suggesting that people actually start talking to providers, which is a big change. If you look at the SIL operational guidelines that came out this week, it also talks about the typical roster of care. So if you've been working with people in SIL, you'll understand what a roster of care is. In future, a person will only need a roster of care once, and that's when they first enter a SIL arrangement. But under this process, they're entering a SIL arrangement without talking to SIL providers yet. So if you're a support coordinator, hopefully you've put 2 and 2 together and you've realised now that you might have to learn how to do rosters of care as well. And if you have seen that spreadsheet, you'll understand that's not as simple as it sounds. It's actually quite a complex spreadsheet. But this process is really going to change things in terms of the home and living process. And we'll talk about that specifically where SDA fits into that process as well a little bit further as we go along today. Right, so that's the background to what SDA is, how it fits, where it fits, etc. I note there's a couple of questions in the chat. So the 29 active SDA providers is just in South Australia, not Australia-wide. I think the number for Australia is about mid 250. Interestingly, there were almost 1,000 registered SDA providers about 6 months ago. But we're seeing a lot of those providers coming up to audit time for renewal of their registration, and they've decided, look, we ticked that box transition, but we've never actually provided any SDA, and we don't actually plan on providing any SDA, so we'll just let that registration time out. So that's why we've seen actually a really big drop in the number of registered providers now. 29 in South Australia, it's not a really big number, to be honest. It's a relatively small number. So another question, the 55 robust, is that whole homes or 55 rooms within a non-robust SDA home? No, so that number is dwellings. So that would be a dwelling that's enrolled purely in the robust category. And that dwelling could be between a two-person setting in a house up to 5, or it could be a 1-person setting in a villa. So they don't give us that level of detail, unfortunately, that we can actually calculate the number of actual beds or bedrooms across the different categories yet. Another question that's come in, if someone already has SDA in their plan, how do you find out what level of SDA they are approved for, e.g. robust? So typically in the individual's plan, in their plan document that comes from the NDIS, it's in the capital section, there'll be a paragraph that talks about what sort of SDA. So it typically should say the style, so it's a house, the accessibility level, and then it should also mention a location. The reason it mentions a location is if you've delved into the SDA price guide, at the back of that price guide, there are location factors, and that's meant to either increase or decrease the base SDA payment to reflect different costs of properties across different locations in Australia. So that's why the location is also important. So it should always be in the individual's plan. Now, across Australia, I see very different, what would I call it, interpretations from different planners about how to write that in the individual's plan, but it seems to be getting better over the years. But that's the place to look. Look at their plan in the capital support section. You should find it. Did anyone want to ask any questions before we move on, sort of around basic SDA 101 sort of information? No? Okay. Let's move on. So second section today, we're going to look at SDA and relationships. Who plays a part in an SDA setting? So again, I'm a visual person, so I like diagrams. I always start things off with diagrams. It really helps explain things, I think. So this is a typical relationship diagram for an SDA setting, and it's not as complicated as it looks. So you've got an SDA owner. The SDA owner doesn't necessarily need to be the SDA provider. And this was set up very purposefully at the start of the scheme to recognise the sheer quantum of housing that was required, estimated around $11 billion worth of housing to meet the SDA demand, and the government recognising that they didn't have that money to invest. So they've set up the SDA, certainly the new SDA payments, to try to entice people from outside of the sector to invest and provide the SDA housing. And so that's why you can have an SDA owner that literally just owns the property, and that's their only involvement in the process from that point. So you move along, the SDA owner then needs to authorise an SDA provider, such as Access to Place, to enrol that property as SDA. And once they enrol that property as SDA, then that SDA provider has ongoing responsibilities and things that they do, and we'll talk about those in a minute. There's a bunch of support providers. So traditionally, rewind 10 years ago, there may have only been one that was doing everything. Now we're definitely seeing, as the NDIS evolves, there might be multiple support providers providing different types of support to that person in their home. Each of those support providers will have a service agreement with the individual. The SDA provider will have a tenancy agreement with that individual, and that's where we see that real separation. Housing being provided by Access to Place, supports being provided by independent organisations, so the two are very separated. Then finally, in alignment with the SDA rules, there's a requirement between the support providers and Access to Place, or the SDA provider, to actually have agreements between those. Those agreements, there's no set form on what that agreement needs to be, but it's basically an agreement about the SDA provider allowing access to the support providers to the property and to the tenants, etc., for provision of supports and so on. And it might detail all various other bits and pieces. Again, there's no sort of set recipe for what that agreement looks like. So the key parties, as I mentioned, the owner can be an investor, it can be a family, can be privately owned, can be governments, etc. Pretty much every state and territory around Australia, the government is or has outsourced their stock as an SDA provider. Access to Place, in this case, as the SDA provider. So basically they're certified with the Quality and Safeguarding Commission, typically Module 5. They might have other modules as well, but Module 5 is the specific one for SDA provider. Support providers, again, they're certified Quality and Safeguarding Commission and registered with the NDIS as well. And then the resident, the most important person in that diagram. But as you can see, there's a lot of other parties typically involved in an SDA setting. I touched on this before, but it's worthwhile just touching on again. In that diagram that I showed, and I'll just skip back to it, each one of the arrows represents an agreement, some form of documentation between the parties. So it is really agreement heavy to set up an SDA environment. So there's an agreement between the owner and the SDA provider, or Access to Place in this case. That can be straightforward. It can be simply a letter, basically just saying, I, as the owner of this property, acknowledge that Access to Place are going to enrol it and claim SDA funding, etc. So that's a big one.
Okay. Yep. I'll let you know.
I'll just find out. There we go. Okay. Agreement between Access to Place and the SIL provider and the support provider. So the language that's typical in the sector at the moment is a collaboration agreement between the support providers and the housing provider. SIL service agreement and other service agreements between the support providers and the individual. And then finally, the SDA service agreement, which effectively is a tenancy agreement between Access to Place and the tenant. There's no set requirements or no set templates for any of these agreements that the NDIS are willing to provide. So it's up to basically each service provider to come up with their own approaches to these agreements. Obviously, tenancy is a little bit different. Tenancy is covered in every state and territory around Australia, South Australia being no different. It has its own requirements at a state level, which also need to be reflected in an SDA tenancy agreement. But the SDA rule also has a bunch of requirements from an NDIS perspective, and they also need to be reflected in the tenancy agreement. So they can be relatively complex documents to put together. But again, that's it is one of the distinct benefits of working with an SDA provider that's got a lot of experience in this sort of thing. So what does the SDA provider do? They enable access, obviously, to the properties. It can be new SDA, can be existing SDA, and in the case of access to place as well, it can offer other opportunities as well, which is another really big thing. As a support coordinator, if you're assisting people to try to access housing and they're not in that lucky 6% for SDA, it's really important to be able to look at and work with partners to look at other options for those individuals as well. So access to place, registered with the Commission against Module 5, which you have to be an SDA provider. SDA provider forms relationships with the people, the tenants. And this is something that I've been involved with access to place on and off for about the past 4 years. And I'm really happy to confirm that access to place in that co-design space in terms of wanting to work with people to design really good outcomes. In the case of access to place, it's not just lip service. They actually really do want to do it. So that's a real distinct advantage as well, especially in the robust category. So the SDA provider has to enter that tenancy agreement with the residents that live there. And in a lot of cases, we're starting to see the SDA provider actually starting to assist some of the people, some of their residents, to engage with support providers as well, to assist them to actually determine what sort of supports or what support provider, what cell provider, etc., might be operating within the particular property. The SDA provider will be the organisation that's claiming the SDA payment from the individual via the portal. So that's one part of the income stream. The second part is the rent payment or the reasonable rent contribution. The reasonable rent contribution is typically paid direct from the resident to, again, to access to place as the SDA provider. In a lot of cases, we see that just being done through centre pay rather than the individual having to remember to do that. So two distinct payments: the SDA payment, which is just another another NDIS payment claim through the portal, and then that direct rent payment. So that's typically what the SDA provider's core responsibilities are. And again, there's no set sort of limits on what you can and can't do. We see SDA providers that do a lot of the property maintenance, do all sorts of bits and pieces around the home. We see other situations where it's actually the support provider has the preference to do that because they engage some of the residents to undertake some of those tasks. So again, there's no set recipe for how all that works. So the support provider's role, and I just put that first point in because I think it's really important to acknowledge that cell providers have had a huge amount of change in the last 18 months. And we've seen that being a real distraction for a lot of cell providers and in basically having to look very inwardly into their organisation. And as a result of that, some of the housing type of things may have slowed down for some people as a result. A lot more change is coming in SIL. So it's another thing to be mindful of, that, again, as a support coordinator, you might have to be a little bit more forceful in prompting some of these people to get off their butts and start the journey, so to speak. And I actually used to be a support coordinator. I take my hat off to all the support coordinators here today. I got out of it because it was just too much. It is a crazy, crazy role. You have to be experts in everything. So it's just one of those things to be really mindful of. We are seeing that tension at the moment between support coordinators and particularly cell providers. ILO, definitely emerging as a preference. It's a definite preference of the NDIS. The reason it's a definite preference of the NDIS is it has capped funding. So to implement an ILO, there are 3 levels of predetermined funding, either 105, 150 or 230,000. That's one of the reasons the NDIS love it, because when they make that decision around a housing option for a person, they can already have the visibility on what the support cost limit could be. If you're cynical like me and you start looking at the reduction in SIL funding, there is too much coincidence in where SIL funding is being reduced to around 250,000 for a lot of people or less. I do think the NDIS have internally have predetermined levels of SIL funding as well that align very closely to the ILO funding. The only reason I don't think they came out in the current operational guidelines that were released this week and actually said these are the levels is because they didn't want a complete right on their hands. So I think it's just going to be a slow step process, but we will see those levels, I would say, in the next 12 months. Support providers enter into support service agreements with tenants, and there can be many. If you are a quality and safeguarding nerd like myself, then you'll understand if you're a support provider and you're providing SIL, community access, transport, a bunch of other things, then in theory, you need a separate service agreement for every one of those different services that you provide. For a lot of providers, property isn't their core business, shouldn't be their core business, but there are a lot of providers that own property. So I think we're going to see, if that separation is enforced, we're going to see a big shift between providers actually divesting properties and focusing on providing support, and then organisations that are professionals at doing property like Access to Place would step up and take their role in providing really good accommodation outcomes for people. A lot of providers, and this is certainly not meant to be in any way disrespectful to providers, but a lot of them don't understand SDA. Even this week, I've met a SIL provider that didn't even know what SDA stood for. So there's still a fair amount of education needed for a lot of the support providers in actually understanding what SDA is. And as we're going through today, it's complex. And there's a lot to understand, and like everything else in the NDIS, it changes. Choice and control and vacancy management issues are really the key issues in that SDA relationships. Vacancies in SDA cause a lot of issues, not only to, especially if it's a SIL provider, because again, SIL providers would understand the pain that vacancy can cause, but also to housing providers as well, especially if it's SDA, because quite often an investor has built that property on the assumption that there's going to be 3 people with high physical support funding living in that home. As soon as one of those people leave, that is a relatively large hole in their income and their investment income. And so that's why, from a SDA perspective, vacancy is also a bit of a pain point as well. And sorry, I just noticed a series of questions there about ILO. My apologies. I get a little bit carried away with acronyms. So yes, it is individual living options. So it is a different style of support. It came out of Western Australia. It was part of the negotiation for Western Australia to join the national scheme that they wanted ILO introduced as a recognised construct of supports within the NDIS. And it is something the NDIS are very much wedded to in terms, so it certainly won't be going away. There was a comment there, would you be able to just explain again separation and housing? So that separation in a contemporary best practice model, and what we suspect the NDIS are going to actually dictate in the near future, will be the person that is the SDA provider that's providing the housing cannot provide the support. The reason behind separation is to honour the person's ability to live in their own home and have choice and control over who comes through the front door and for what reason they come through the front door. So if we rewind 10 years into the old disability model, it was quite often that the housing and support would be provided by the one organisation. So in the situation where a person living in that house didn't like the support, quite often the option that was available to them was to move. Under the NDIS, under the choice and control, the theory is that a person's home is their home, and they should have the right to be able to choose who provides the support in their home and to be able to change that. So there needs to be that separation in a lot of cases to enable that to occur. Now, as you probably all be aware, under the SIL shared support model, having that level of choice and control is a bit mute, because in a shared support model under SIL, you typically have to have the one provider providing the shared support. You might be able to have other people doing the one-to-one, but in a lot of cases, the choice and control is a little bit limited in a shared living environment. But that's something else Wasn't going to go into detail today, but there's a whole bunch of theory and different approaches you can do around that as well. So
Brett, sorry, I think, did you answer Reagan's question about how long does the owner have to commit their property as an SDA?
Right. No, sorry, I missed that one. They don't have to commit it at all in terms of a time frame. And that's, again, one of the issues that has occurred. So a person that decides to invest a home and build an SDA home, they're typically doing so based on the forward cash flow that home is going to generate for them. SDA payments are a 20-year payment stream at the new SDA level. So in most cases, an investor would keep a home for around 20 years, but there is nothing stopping that person turning around in 2 years' time and saying, I'm going to sell the property. What we are seeing, however, especially if it is a new SDA home, from a financial perspective, there are a number of SDA investment funds, Australian Unity being one of the sort of the more prominent ones. They buy SDA properties off investors that are up and operating, that have got tenants in them, and they actually value them on a commercial basis. They value the cash flow that's coming in, so the owner can actually get quite significantly higher purchase price for their home than they would if it was just a normal residential property. So that's one of the saving graces for SDA staying as SDA for long term in the future, is that it has an unusually high cash flow attached to it, as opposed to an open market property. But there are no guarantees, unfortunately. Okay. So that's it in terms of the relationships and who's who in the zoo, how they all fit together in a typical SDA setting. Anyone have any questions around that? And please, if I do start getting a little bit bad with my acronyms again, just pull me up on it, because I do tend to jump into the jargon a little bit. No questions? Okay. We'll get on to the stuff that I suspect that is probably going to be of a little bit more interest. Excuse me for a second. SDA eligibility. So, such a very simple diagram to explain a very complicated and random process. So if you look at the SDA rules, it tells us there are really two key criteria: extreme functional impairment and very high support needs. They're sort of the two key phrases. So extreme functional impairment, and we'll look at these in a little bit more detail. So it's typically someone has mobility assistance, they need assistance for self-care, self-management, and generally have very high person-to-person support requirements. Very high support needs, they could have previously lived in SDA or some form of disability accommodation. Very high person-to-person support needs. We used to use a rule of thumb that it was between 6 to 8 personal care interventions in a 24-hour period, but there seems to be a little bit more randomness sinking in on that side of things, so we don't generally use that as a rule of thumb anymore. So again, it looks so simple around eligibility. So we'll look at some of the definitions of extreme functional impairment. So impairment results in extremely reduced functional capacity of the participant to undertake one or more of the activities of mobility, self-care, self-management, and the participant has very high need for person-to-person supports and undertaking activity, even with assistive technology, equipment, home modifications, etc. The reason I'm sort of focusing on this language is this language is what a housing solution report needs to address primarily. In its rawest form, the housing solution report needs to answer those two questions and put an argument forward that satisfies point A and point B on behalf of the individual to prove that they fit those descriptions. That's the ultimate goal of the housing solution report. When it goes to the NDIS, the first thing they do is pull out the reasonable and necessary test. And this is some of the things that the housing panels, some of the tests that they will put on each individual housing solution report. So, would the SDA be likely to better assist the participant to pursue the goals, objectives, aspiration of the participant statement, goals and aspirations? Now, to answer that question, you can't just say yes. it would, or we believe it would. You kind of need to get to that point by ruling out all the other options. So the SDA is the last thing left on the table as the one that would be likely to better support the person to do it. Be likely to be more effective and beneficial, having regard to current good practice, which is such a political yes minister sort of statement and can be interpreted and bended any way that the housing panels would like that to be used. Value for money. Now, this is a big one. And as I mentioned before, when you're actually looking at the housing solution report and looking at the SDA solution for a person, you cannot lose sight of the support cost. Being able to answer both what the SDA outcome should be, but then also what the support cost, what the assistive technology cost, what that might look like should the person be found eligible for that particular SDA outcome, will get you a much better result because it answers their question. The housing panel isn't sitting there sort of nervously going, yeah, but if I approve this, does that mean I'm also approving $800,000 a year in SIL funding? Because I've got no feel for what that support might look like for that individual. So by giving some of that information to enable that decision, you solve so many problems. You just take that risk out of it for the agency. And we'll talk about that and a lot more when we get to that point. It would promote stability and continuity of supports, particularly for participants currently residing in SDA. So that last statement is typically around the person that was in some form of disability accommodation pre-NDIS. They've transitioned in that accommodation into the NDIS, and they decide to put their hand up and go, I want to be tested to actually move into one of those beautiful new apartments or that beautiful new house or whatever. So that's typically the one there that they apply in that situation. So what's the process for eligibility? So as I mentioned before, everything is now in home and living is being driven by that request for home and living support request form. The language is still around the agency, highly suggests that you should fill that form out, et cetera, et cetera. It's more than that because they need that form to basically start the process. The reason they need that form is they've got themselves a shiny new IT system that sits behind the home and living part of the NDIS now. And every person that is in the home and living construct within the NDIS sits in that new IT system. And it measures timeframes for responses, timeframes for approvals, et cetera, et cetera. To get data into that system, the entry point is the home and living support request form. So that's why they're actually requiring that form to be filled out. It is a pre-decision tool. There's no doubt about it. So you submit that form and relatively promptly, I've heard some as quick as 2 weeks. I've heard 6 weeks typically being an average. And I've heard 3 months. And that was in a particular region that just had a horrible track record of being timely anyway. It should trigger a plan review. And at that plan review, the home and living goals are discussed. And I can see one lady shaking her head, which is obviously in a region where they're not getting that sort of timeliness of response. So at the planning meeting, there should be 2 specific home and living funding options offered. Exploration and design. Now, exploration and design is language that has come from ILO. It used to be only in the ILO model. Thanks to the changes, everyone now gets exploration and design funding, regardless of what the support might look like for them. Exploration and design funding is capped. It's capped at either 3,000, 5,000 or 10,000. 3,000 is for a person that is already living independently and want to change a few things, or a person that might be living at home but has really strong advocacy, really strong family. They know where they're going to move to, they know who they're going to live with, they know what sort of support environment they want, and they just need someone to pull it together and document it for them. The other end of the spectrum, the $10,000 would be the person that wants to change their living environment but has no idea where to start. Interestingly, the line item to draw down on for that funding is exactly the same as support coordination. It's the same registration group. So what that means, I suspect, are the people that you're supporting will naturally look towards you for that exploration and design process because it just happens to be the same registration group as support coordination. I'm not necessarily saying you jump up and down and say, yes, I'll do it. But I think you should definitely start to expect people wanting you to do it or expecting you to do it. Similar in the SDA market, we've seen a lot of people specialise and just specialise in writing housing solution reports. They're specialist support coordinators, etc. I think there's a real opportunity for support coordinators to specialise in home and living exploration and design, for example, because it is such a specialised field. Go to that planning meeting, you get your funding for exploration and design. If specialist disability accommodation is thought to be possible, you should receive extra funding to do the housing solution report. It is not part of the exploration and design funding. We've already heard from some planners around the country thinking the exploration and design funding also covers SDA. We have it in writing that it does not. So if you're getting that sort of pushback from planners, please let me know. And I can give you the written explanation on how it works. So once the person gets that funding, as your support coordinator, you run off and you do all this work for them to design what their home and living future is going to look like. If it's ILO, it will be an ILO service proposal. And there's a template of what that document looks like available on the NDIS website. If it's SIL, again, going back to that change and that new process, the person needs their initial roster of care to be created for them. Now, providers aren't involved in theory at this stage. So there's going to be a need potentially for support coordinators to be able to construct a roster of care to be able to come up with what that SIL funding might look like for people, or may have to engage with a provider to actually assist in putting that roster of care together. The change in language in the SIL operational guidelines this week make it very clear, it's there in black and white. The NDIS will not talk to providers anymore about an individual SIL funding, full stop. They will only talk to support coordinators, the individual, their family, etc. A provider can no longer put in a request for review of decision around SIL funding. The agency has shut the door on providers in terms of talking about SIL funding, and SIL's becoming much more individual, like everyone else's funding. SIL funding used to have the service bookings made by the agency. It used to almost be quarantined for the provider. SIL funding is now going into the individual's flexible call, and providers have to make their own service bookings and have those one-to-one negotiations with people. So it's a huge amount of change on that front. Circling back to the process, you put all that information together, you put it back to the planners. The funding's already there. They've already allocated the funding. So going back to the agency is really just a box ticking exercise. I also think it's a bit of a compliance streaming exercise as well. Okay, well, this person's going to be receiving their supports in a SIL environment, right? So they're sort of in that compliance stream. That's about all that process is for. It's circling back to just tick the box, and then the person implements the outcomes. Again, it sounds so easy. Don't know why support coordinators are so stressed all the time. But it is it's a laborious, complex process, and it is literally one person at a time. It's in this process as well where I think it is really, really important where you can partner on the housing side of things with organisations like Access to Place that can take some of the pressure off you from the housing side, and they can start helping you say, right, well, let's look at the SDA eligibility. Do we think they're going to be eligible? Yeah, look, I think there is an opportunity here. Okay, let's go down that path. Let's test SDA eligibility. If it's absolutely not going to be on the table, then it's okay, what other options are possible? What sort of community housing, social housing, etc., might be available? So working with a housing partner, especially as we head down a separation model, really, really important in the future. So just some points that I've sort of accumulated over the last 5 years is having met various people that sit on those housing panels, and something that I still shake my head about 2 years ago, via the SDA Alliance, 3 of the SDA Alliance members, including myself, did online training for the NDIS housing panel members to understand SDA, which I still just scratch my head about. But moving along, what they look for. They look for a really well-structured report that's almost a bit of a once upon a time. It's a bit of a story about the individual. It talks about the person's history, their goals. Really importantly, it talks about what options have been explored. If a housing solution report, page 1 goes, this person, high physical support, 2-bedroom apartment, et cetera, but there's no discussion about any other options that were considered and why that option is the only option for that person, the person will not get the outcome. I can guarantee that. The housing panels look for any reason possible to give the lowest cost outcome from an SDA perspective. So reports that rule out other options to arrive at the SDA and don't just focus on SDA of a specific type, they're the ones that have the success. So you've got to take the story, you've got to take the people along on the journey and arrive at a point where SDA is obviously the best outcome for this individual. You also have to show that from not only a human perspective, but also from a financial perspective. So that's where you need to be able to show that if this person lived in this setting, this is what their support cost would look like. However, if they're not successful in living in that setting and they move to this setting, their support cost is $200,000 more a year because the built environment doesn't support their disability. They're going to need more help with this and more help with that, and et cetera, et cetera. So using that sort of financial as well as the storytelling is what the housing panel looks like. You've got to, and I'm never, ever going to defend people that sit on that housing panel, but the one thing I will say is those people are public servants and they're making potentially multi-million-dollar decisions. You've got to get them in a comfortable place where it satisfies everything, so that it almost compels the person on the housing panel to say, yes, that is the only outcome. That is the obvious outcome. And I'm really comfortable to now commit millions of dollars of taxpayers' money for that person to receive that SDA funding for the rest of their life. So if you put your sort of self in that sort of decision-making process, you can understand the importance of this story that has to be in the housing solution report. Some rules of thumbs of what sort of access levels. Independent transfers. So if a person can transfer independently in or out of bed, in or out onto the toilet, for example, they will not get high physical support. So the determinator between fully accessible and high physical support typically is the person's ability to independently transfer. That's one of the really big things that they focus on. Likewise, for robust, it's very typical that a person will receive robust funding if there's some history of property damage. It doesn't have to be property damage, but it could be an extreme level of interaction with other people living with them that as a result of an injury, etc. But it has to be relatively extreme level before robust gets ticked. If robust doesn't get ticked, it will be improved livability because it's really the only other category. And as I mentioned earlier on today, improved livability and robust are dimensionally similar. It's just the bits and pieces that are used to build the dwellings are very different, potentially in a robust setting. And I'm very happy if anyone has any other questions around the housing panel and how they operate, etc. I'm happy to answer those. And I will just have a quick look at what has happened in the chat. What's exploration and design across the board called stage 1? So stage 1 is language we're still seeing just in ILO. So stage 1, exploration and design, whereas in a SIL or a more broader home and living context, it's just referred to as exploration and design. So interestingly, up until about 2 months ago, the ILO team and the SIL team were very separate within the NDIS, and they're now bringing those teams together. So what I think we'll see in the future is from the individual's perspective. They'll go through this process of exploration and design. You'll be designing supports, potentially with flatmates, family members, neighbours, all sorts of various formal and informal supports. You design that in a way that really suits the individual. As far as the individual is concerned, they don't really care whether it's called ILO or SIL or whatever it is. That's an NDIS term to enable the back office and the administration to occur and the compliance, etc., to occur. So we're starting to see the lines between flexible core, ILO and SIL become very blurry. And I think that is very, very conscious decision. And it's something that we're going to see more focus on blurring the lines. I personally think we'll see in 5 years' time, the brands will almost disappear and a person will receive independent living funding, full stop. And how they choose to spend that will be up to them. Okay, can you just go over the 3,000 capping? So the capping in stage 1 of ILO, which is where SIL is now operating in that exploration and design phase as well, there are 3 levels of funding, either 3,000, 5,000 or 10,000. To get the 3,000 funding, it's the individual is either already living independently and wants to change a few things, or it's a person that, say, is leaving home for the first time, but they have really strong family advocacy. They know they have already identified the property they want to live in, who they want to live with. So they just need someone to pull it all together and document it in a way that suits the NDIS to basically get the tick for their funding. The 5,000 is someone that needs some more support doing that. So let's say, for example, they might have already identified who they want to move out with, but they need some assistance finding a home and they need some assistance with a few other bits and pieces. The 10,000 is a person that doesn't know where to start. So it could be someone living at home, could be someone in a nursing home, etc. that goes, I want to move. That's as much as I know. I don't know where, how do I do it? Who helps me? What sort of supports I'll need, etc., etc. So that generally, and in the ILO operational guideline, it gives you a lot more exploration around those 3 different funding levels and what a person might look like if you're interested to sort of jump into there. Did anyone have any questions on eligibility before we move on? Please do jump in now if you do, because we are going to move on.
Sorry, I did miss this question, but when you put in your home and living submission, should you have a functional capacity assessment for housing with that?
No.
Oh.
No. So as you've probably picked up, I'm a little bit cynical when it comes to motivations of the NDIS. And that comes twofold from being a consultant in the space for 6 years and also having a son who's a participant. It can drive you insane at times. But what I believe the home and living support request form, as I mentioned earlier, it is literally one of the reasons they need is to trigger that IT system and start the tracking of an individual through all the processes. I do strongly believe, for say, in my son's case, where he hasn't previously had home and living goals and now he's got home and living goals, it's a pre-decision tool. And I've tested this with a number of people around Australia where people have provided, and I think that request form is laughable. It's a 17-page form. When I think of form, I think of 1 or 2 pages, not 17 pages. It's a huge amount of information it asks for. I've seen cases where people have given a lot of time and a lot of effort to fill that form out, get functional capacity assessments, get reports, get all sorts of bits and pieces together, submit the form. When they get to that plan review meeting, the NDIS have already made their mind up. They've already decided what the future for that person is. Conversely, where a person hasn't provided much information at all, and the agency hasn't had a lot of information already on file for that individual, they have a really good conversation and they get really good exploration and design funding, and they get funding to go off and get the functional capacity assessments and all that sort of thing. So it's a bit of it depends on the person and what stage of life and their journey, but it also depends on the region. See different approaches between different regions. But again, I generally advise people the bare minimum on that form.
Because I've been asked by LACs numerous times that the functional capacity assessment has to go with the home and living form.
Yeah, I'll just say I don't have one.
Okay.
And who's the LAC in your region?
Oh, well, I've got a few.
In terms of the organisation?
This was Feros, and I've had one from Batcare as well.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, look, I again, and it's probably a bit facetiously, but I generally just ignore LACs. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. How important are the right allied health reports to the SDA panel? They are vital, absolutely vital. And that's what we're about to go through in the last section, looking at what that report should contain, etc. But they are the key. And there are two really important things. The time, as soon as possible before that submission is made, not 6 months old, not 12 months old. Month old is preferable if you can possibly pull it off. And I realize that that isn't easy in a lot of cases. But also making sure there's a bunch of reports typically that you put on a housing solution report as the attachments, making sure they all speak to each other. I recommend where possible, I get all of the specialists, all the allied health, all the psychologists, everyone that's going to be involved in preparing reports specifically with the housing solution report in mind. I get them in the one place in a meeting like this and I brief them. These are the goals. This is what we were trying to achieve. I'm not telling you how to write your report. I'm not asking you to not put anything in your report that you can't put your hand on your heart and justify. But this is the outcome we are trying to achieve. So in that discussion, you might all arrive at a situation where, look, we think in general, this person could share with one other person. Seems reasonable, fits with that person's goals, etc. If that's the case, then the psychologist, the OT, every other person that's involved in writing the reports have to reflect that in their report. If one report says that person can share with 3 others, expect the housing panel to find that. And you'll get an outcome of, yes, they can live in the style of property that they wanted, but they're going to share with 3 others, not one other. And when you jump up and down and say why, they'll say, well, your report suggested it, which makes it very hard then to take it through reviews and AATs and et cetera, et cetera. Vitally, vitally important. That's a really good question. Let's talk about the housing solution report. So it's a real delicate balance of choice and control and reasonable and necessary. You can't just write it from a choice and control perspective and think the agency will just fund whatever it is that the choice and control drives. Likewise, it can't just be tested and reasonable and necessary. There has to be the balance between what the person wants versus what is reasonable in terms of the funding side of things. As I mentioned before, depending on what level of SDA it is, it's potentially a multi-million-dollar decision, and it's being made by a mid-level public servant. So you've got to make them comfortable to make that level of decision. I always circle back to that word, comfortable. So you've got to make sure that that person sitting there reading it almost feels compelled to say yes. It must be a story, and it must be a carefully constructed argument at the same time. There's a couple of specialists around Australia who specialise in writing these housing solution reports. It's actually probably much more than a couple now. One of those particular individuals writes really legalistic reports. So it basically breaks down the SDA rules, the framework, etc., and presents the report in kind of an argument refuting or addressing each one of the statements in their legislation. That person initially had really good success with those reports for a couple of years, and now is having terrible outcomes because the housing panels are sick of receiving almost a legal argument as to why the person should get the outcome that's being requested, rather than a story, again, that almost compels them to make that decision. It's a really important point. It's a fine point to achieve. Pardon me. Typical table of contents for a housing solution report. What's the objective? What's the background? Performance areas, performance components, assessment analysis, talking about SDA eligibility, suitability, type and location, home modifications, have they been considered? Support coordination, transition planning, really, really important to include that, because the extra allied health support, specialist support and support coordination either side of a person transitioning to living in a new location is massive. And if you overlook it, you could be tens of thousands of dollars in the red, because you do need that additional assistance, and it is quite valid and the housing panel want to see that information because, again, they want to see what's the total financial decision of making the yes for this particular outcome. Summarize it. And again, the summary is not this big emotive story pleading. It's just a pretty short summary. And we're going to look at these in a bit more detail. Annexures and references. So in this case, the written report was 37 pages long, and I'll show you in a little bit how many attachments this particular report had. There were a bunch of attachments. Typical time to write one of these reports, having spoken to a bunch of people around Australia that have been pulling these reports together, about 40 hours to write one of these reports properly. So it's not insignificant. I do encourage, and again, if I put my old support coordinator hat on, I certainly would have been in the place to try to seek out someone that specialises in doing this and potentially work with them to pull this report together. You can still do all the liaison with your client. You can gather up all the specialist reports that the person needs, but getting that specialist to pull it all together is probably the most economical and efficient way potentially of pulling the final report together. Those specialists, that's what they do, and they generally have really good success. They can gauge the mood of the housing panels. They can sort of make the changes that are required over time to make sure that they maximise the outcome. Quite importantly as well, a lot of those specialists, when you initially start speaking to them, they look at some of the initial information around a person. They're the people that can give you the, look, I think you're wasting your time. That's important to know. So you can start managing the expectations of your client about what you think the outcome of the process might be. Because remember, 6% of people in the NDIS are going to be eligible for SDA. So there's going to be a whole lot of people who test the eligibility and don't get the outcome that they thought they'd get. So I think that's another real benefit of using some of those specialists. So in this particular case, the objective, Mr. X was referred to Empower Health Services for the purpose of assessing his eligibility for specialist disability accommodation. When it was completed, who else was involved, what other things were observed, etc. But again, it doesn't have to be War and Peace. Keep it short, because housing panels meet is usually 3 panels that meet a week. Each panel will assess somewhere between 4 to 10 housing solution reports, and there's usually 3 people on the panel. So if you think about those 3 people, they've got a lot of stuff to read in that panel session. So keep it short. Don't waste a single word. Make sure it's really, really carefully constructed. Background. So typically breaking the background into medical, treatment, social, home environment. Depending on the individual, there might be other sections that's important to understand about that individual. In this particular case, the medical background, again, just bullet points, just bang, bang, bang. It doesn't have to be drawn out. CP is CP. So just put it out there. List all, and typically in a descending order of primary, secondary, other complications, etc. And effectively, that list there, that's my son. That's exactly how his list looks. And that's how it looks in his housing solution report. So you can have a little bit of further explanation if there is something extreme going on, which is going to have a real important part to play in the overall housing and support solution for that individual. So in this particular case, it's 3 to 30 seizures per day. Now that's going to have a big influence in terms of what housing and support looks like for Mr. X. It's going to have a huge impact. Those seizures, typical, again, triggered by climate, overtired, physical contact, falling over, etc., energy drinks, etc., caffeine, again, just some of those real triggers. I typically, and I just picked this as a random sample of a report, I would generally say the ingesting energy drinks or excessive caffeine, I would probably try to word that in a way where his access to food and beverage isn't monitored or something along those lines. Always try to bring it back to the home because remember, this is a housing solution report. Finish it off with any statements. So again, in this particular case, talking about how this person actually mobilises, uses the wheelchair just because of the extreme risk of seizures and obviously what that would lead to, etc. I'm not going to go through the detail in every single section of this, but you will get these slides. So where there's a section where there's a huge amount of information, I won't go through it in a huge amount of detail, but you'll have the example when you do get the slides. So in the case of Mr. X, we looked at assessment areas, including mobility and what that looks like, what sort of support is needed, particular focus on transfers, and a particular focus on mobility in the home, because as I mentioned before, the ability to independently transfer will determine between fully accessible and high physical support, typically. Then personal care, so the typical types of assessments that are carried out: eating, grooming, dressing, bathing, toileting, medication. There can be others depending on the individual's needs. There's no specified list of assessments that the agency will or will not consider. It's entirely up to typically the OT or the other people involved in pulling these reports together to actually determine what are the best tools to use for the assessments. So in this case, mobility, just talking about how Mr. X gets around when he's home. So little, again, bullet points. You'll notice there that the third bullet point talks about transfers. Really important to talk about the transfers, because if you don't, you won't get the outcome that you're after. Balance, another good thing. So again, it's going to be different for each individual, but this is just giving you an example of how the information is presented. And obviously, all of these things will have references off to the attachments. So it could be requires transfers, etc., etc., etc. Refer Appendix B, report for page 47, which is the OT report, where it talks in more detail around transfers and what sort of support's required, etc. So always refer off to the attachments rather than putting too much information in this sort of covering report. Again, what you want this to do is tell a story. Dressing, so again, just outline what sort of assistance you might need with dressing. It's really important in these areas as well, with like dressing, personal care, etc. If things have been tried, so different aids, different assistive technologies have been tried, whether they've been successful, whether they haven't been successful, put them in there because it answers the question that will come up in the people's mind. Okay, so he's having trouble with dressing, but has he tried specialist clothing? Or has he tried this? Has he tried that? So answer those questions if you do know the answers to them. So again, more assessment areas: domestic activities, daily living, meals, housework, maintenance, cleaning, washing, all of those types of things can be included in that list. Community activities, daily living. How does the person get around? What sort of transport requirements? Do they need assistance with financial management, shopping, etc.? The list goes on and on. It's typically in this area where you introduce the support side of things and what the support models might look like as well, because you're addressing those specific activities of assistance with daily living effectively. Meal preparation, again, I won't go through this in any huge level of detail, but just talk about some of the key points in the story that helps tell the story of why this person needs assistance in these particular areas. Performance components, so all sorts of things that come up in here. I don't think there'll be a same list for pretty much any individual. It will vary depending on the nature of their impairments and challenges and history and experiences. This just gives you an example. But what I'm trying to sort of impart here is, as a support coordinator, supporting a client to go out and get reports across these things, it's not as simple as just sending off half a dozen emails and booking in some reports, etc. Because as I mentioned before, you need to find people that are available, and then you ideally want to get them all together. If you can't get them all together before they start writing the reports, at least prepare a little bit of a brief that you can send with each request or confirmation that they're going to meet with the client and construct the report. so that that specialist, OT, allied health, whoever they are, understand the purpose of why they're writing the report. You're not leading them, you're not asking them to write anything in there that they shouldn't. You're just giving them the purpose, and that's really important. Standard outcome measures and analysis. So again, all sorts of different models that can be used. And I've seen in a lot of cases, multiple ones being used. And again, tell the story and the outcomes of those various models and tools that have been used and how they all sort of culminate in pointing towards a particular outcome. Pardon me. So address, when you start getting to the point where you're starting to talk about what sort of housing solution is going to look right for this person. Start then looking at the SDA rule information around eligibility and start building the story around why Mr. X why he satisfies extreme functional impairment, why he has very high person-to-person support needs. So use their language. And I think if you remember back to that section today where we introduced that extreme functional impairment definition, I made the point then of saying it's okay to use their language. And in fact, it's really important to use their language back at them. Just don't do it in a legalistic sense. Just make sure that you've addressed it using their language, because then there can be no lost in translation. Supporting evidence. So in supporting evidence, massively important, obviously, and we'll touch on that a little bit further. When you start moving towards the SDA solution that all the reports and all the story culminates in pointing in the right direction, start talking, and before you get to the SDA recommendation, talk about what other housing options have been considered. So you've looked at this and it's not suitable for this reason. You've looked at other options and there could be a history. This person may have tried different types of housing models before and hasn't been successful in sustaining that tenancy for whatever reason. Put it in the report, because what it really points to is there is no other option. Because they've already been tried, or they've been considered and they've been deemed inappropriate for whatever reason the case may be. When you go to a design category in your SDA recommendation, back it up with supporting reasons tied back to those assessment outcomes. So you need to be able to point off to all the specialist reports saying, we agree with OT, with this person, that the best outcome is this design category for the following reasons. Preferred location, typically it might be family, it might be social, it might be employment related, that there's a preferred location. It could be lifestyle based as well. I get asked this question a lot. Is it okay to go down to a specific address? That this person wants to move into the brand new apartment being built by XYZ investor at this location. I generally err against that. Purely because the housing panels sometimes get a little bit sensitive around, is this person being coerced by the investor to move into this SDA, and do they really want to move into this SDA? Not every housing panel member thinks like that, some do. So if it was, say, beautiful location at Glenelg, for example, I would just say they want to live in Glenelg. I wouldn't put it down to a specific address, for example, just to be safe. It's fine if the person already has their eye and maybe even have a non-conditional offer to move in there, that's fine, but I just wouldn't go that far in the actual housing solution report. Home mods and assistive technology. If home modifications have been used in previous accommodation that has been proved not successful, please include that, because it rules out home modification of another type of property. Home modifications are not eligible in SDA. So you don't want to tie a home modification to SDA. The SDA owner is expected to make minor modifications to an already specialist built property to suit each individual, but you will not get home modification funding for it. And in fact, if you do spend home modification funding on an enrolled SDA property, the property will be unenrolled as SDA. That's how stringent they are around that. Assistive technology needs to be part of the story as well. Need to talk about what sort of assistive technology the person would need to support their tenancy in that particular location. So if they need uninterrupted power supply, they need a ceiling hoist, they need automatic door openers, climate control, whatever the case may be, it needs to be in this report. Because again, the housing panel members want to make sure they know the full financial implication of the decision you're asking them to make. It's also important too, because what happens with that housing panel, they don't make a decision. And this is where it gets legally AAT sort of related important. The housing panel makes a recommendation. That recommendation goes back to the planner. It's the planner that makes the decision. And it's the planner that translates that decision into the individual's plan. So you want to make sure that that recommendation includes, when it gets translated into the plan, funding for assistive technology, because that assistive technology goes hand in hand with the solution, to the point that if they don't get the assistive technology, the solution won't work for them. As the SDA provider, that's a nightmare, because you've got a person moving in to establish a new tenancy that's struggling because they don't have the assistive technology. And as a support provider, it's worse, because it means you've got to put more people generally into the support model for a period of time until the assistive technology gets there. So doing it at the same time is really, really important. I will just also touch on, if you do cost in assistive technology, which generally will be on some form in the housing solution report, include the ongoing maintenance. Make sure it's not just the outright capital. If there's an annual service requirement, or if there's an upgrade requirement, or whatever the case may be, include that in there and say over the next 5 years, this is what the maintenance spend is likely to be per annum, because you will get funded for that if you ask. So support coordination and transition, again, as I mentioned before, really important to also build that into the housing solution report. If this person is successful, we recommend the following in terms of additional specialist OT, allied health support, plus support coordination, plus whatever else might be required, and map it out. Actually map it out, model it out, number of hours times by the rate. This is the amount of money we're asking for. Generally, 99% of the cases, it gets approved. And it's really important to get a really good outcome. So this is just an example here of justifying additional support coordination. So we actually asked for an additional 20 hours for Mr. X. Additional occupational therapy, speech pathology, and the speech pathology in that case could be to actually help him better conversation with new flatmates or whatever the case might be. But you'll see they're not insignificant numbers of money, 10,000 there, 10,000 there. And in this particular case, it was all approved. And it made the difference in terms of making that transition successful for everyone. Final summary, just bring it all back together. Paragraph at the most 2, I recommend. Just keep it short, because again, remembering by the time this could be the 8th housing solution report that particular panel meeting has read, you don't want to keep them any longer than you need to get your message across. This was the supporting information for Mr. X. And I think if you remember, the actual report, sort of the main bringing it all together, was at 30 odd pages. This was about 270 pages, all totaled up in terms of the attached information. I can almost guarantee they would have gone to the OT report. They would have gone to the behaviour support plans. They'll go to some of those real key documents where there'll be recommendations around how many people can this person live with? Why is this level? Why is high physical support important for this person? They want to find the evidence, and you've pointed it to them in your covering document. So they just go and check it off, have a bit of a read, bingo. So again, you just don't want to give them any reason to say no. So then you bring it all together. A couple of final hints: make sure you read all the supporting information to make sure there's no conflicts. The last thing you want to happen is to have one specialist report saying can share with 2 people, and then one saying can share with 3, because you'll get the lower cost outcome in most cases. Target a specific accessible level, style and location, as I've mentioned, not down to a street address. Include the assistive technology. Support quote development in parallel, so you can include the support cost and potentially different iterations of the support cost. So if this person gets to move in this style of SDA that we're asking for, we think their support cost is going to be circa 200,000 per annum. However, if they don't get high physical support, they're going to need all this additional person-to-person support. We actually think their support cost might be 300,000, which again, for the person making that big financial decision will go, well, that just makes sense. In the holistic picture of what this total cost is, that's better value for money for the agency to actually go that way. Bring it all together, hopefully get the right outcome, get the funding in the person's plan, and then live happily ever after. Sounds so easy now we've got to this stage of the discussion. And I just did make that final point there, that process of transition for an individual is resource intensive. I always tell people, think about what it might take and double it. And then you'll probably get to about the right level of support that you might need from all the various people. And just to show that I do sympathise with support coordinators, in terms of a support coordinator's role in housing or home and living in the NDIS, this is about the most simplistic I could make this model of what a support coordinator is supposed to know and to be able to assist people with, which I won't dwell on it because it'll probably make you all get headaches and maybe even start crying, but it is a huge amount of information, and SDA just being one very small part of that puzzle. But it is a very complex and very involved part, I must admit. And I hope today, I know it's been a lot of information that we've covered today, but hopefully you do feel a little bit more comfortable around SDA and what it is all about. So I just wanted to quickly circle back to access to place, and I've mentioned it a number of times throughout today, but again, one of the really successful outcomes in this process is partnering with someone on the housing side that can really help and can relieve some of that load. Because as we've been through today, and as you already know, I'm not going to sort of tell you how to suck eggs, but housing is complicated and it can burn so much time in terms of, from a support coordinator's perspective, to try to get access and try to understand the different outcomes that might be available. So that's where I really do encourage to partner up with someone like Access to Place. And I think, Trent, did you want to say something further along those lines?
Yeah, thank you, Brent. First of all, just thank you, Brent, for the presentation today. I think it's very informative. Hope all the people participating found it informative and beneficial as well. Very insightful. I appreciate your candour and humour. And try not to wear your cynical hat too much during the course of the presentation. So it's fantastic. Thank you. Yes, access to place, like Ashley alluded to earlier, not-for-profit registered charity, community housing provider. We're very keen to provide contemporary purpose-built disability accommodation for members of the South Australian community. Many would know we've recently completed 6 fully accessible homes in Aldinga, where we still have two properties vacant, a whole home vacant for tenancy. We're looking to develop some apartment buildings in 2022, which will come online and available in 2023, which will be at high physical support standard. And excitingly, we've got a pipeline of 12 purpose-built homes, which we'll construct and develop in 2022, where we've gone about that as a bespoke tenant-centred approach, dealing with the families and other stakeholders involved with the tenant for purpose-built accommodation for those individuals as well, which is really exciting. And I guess with the support coordinators in attendance today, we'd welcome further inquiries in times ahead where we can discuss your participants and your clients where they're inappropriately housed, and hopefully come up with a great solution for those members as well. So in saying that, also like to thank other participants attending today, Representative South Australian Housing Authority, NDIA, other community housing providers, and I know there's some directors of Access to Place in attendance as well. So thank you all once again, and also just a quick shout out to Ashley Pipe for putting the whole event together. Did a great job. Thanks, Ash.
Excellent. Thank you, Trent.
Sorry, just one other thing, Brent. Ashley's whispering in my ear to if you could also like our Facebook page. I'm pretty naive when it comes to social media, but you can like our social media page. That would be great, and go into the draw to win a $50 voucher. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. So do have a bit of time for any final questions. And there is one question in there around SDA properties and home modifications. So home modification funding, as it stands within the NDIS, that can be funded in an individual's plan across all the different levels of home modification. That type of funding cannot be used on an enrolled SDA property. Now, they did that on purpose for a couple of reasons. The agency's opinion around the SDA prices is that it covers the cost of reasonable modifications for a person to make it more accessible. Now, keeping in mind that that initial accessibility match should be done right up front by, is it high physical support? Is it improved livability? So there's a bit of matching that gets done straight away. If, however, the person needs some minor adjustments around the home. So what's a minor adjustment? It might be changing the type of tap or changing a light switch or those types of minor types of adjustments. The expectation is the owner will actually carry out those modifications. And it is actually there in the SDA rule. So by an owner deciding to build an SDA, they've kind of implicitly already agreed that they will make some of those minor modifications. Now, if it gets to the point, let's say a person's living in improved livability, they're ambulant, they need a bit of help, maybe it's vision impairment and intellectual impairment is this person's primary challenges, and they have a catastrophic stroke. So they go from improved livability to high physical support. The agency are reasonable in that situation and they will reassess the SDA eligibility, and generally that person would then be eligible for high physical support. Where it gets complicated is if that person goes, well, I don't want to move. This is my home. I've been approved for improved livability. I now need to make that high physical support. There's no easy outcome in that process because the level of modification to take it from improved livability to high physical support is impractical to retrofit in a person's house. It's widening all the doorways, potentially widening the hallways, potentially moving light switch locations, whatever. It just gets cost prohibitive. So the rare cases, and I'm aware of 2 in my 6 years that have fallen into that category, it's an individual one-on-one negotiation to get an outcome that works for all parties that have a stake in the outcome. There's no easy answer to that one, unfortunately. If it's a person that's living in high physical support and they do deteriorate over time, MS, motor neurone, whatever the case may be, or just aging, it is the expectation those minor modifications that might be needed to be made around the home is provided by the SDA provider. And that could be a person gets more arthritic or loses more control of their hands. They do need to change the taps, light switches, that sort of stuff. That is the expectation. The SDA provider will do that, or the owner, I should say. I'm more than happy in the 3 minutes we have remaining. If anyone does have any other questions, please. As I said right at the outset, I'd hate anyone to leave today. Access to Place have been awesome to work with in pulling this together. I think there should be more housing providers around Australia actually doing this to assist the sector to get a better understanding of SDA, because it's complex. The linkages between SDA and support are now just, you can't ignore them. Previously SDA, you could kind of go on an SDA journey and then worry about support, and you just can't do that anymore. It's such a very, very complex combined situation. Okay, so for example, for high physical support, ceiling hoist would upgrade to tracking be the SDA responsibility, and the actual hoisting, no. So typically we're a ceiling hoist. So first of all, for a ceiling hoist to be able to be installed in the property, it would have been high physical support to begin with. So let's assume it was, and the person didn't need a hoist, or they had a mobile hoist, and there's been a deterioration and they now need a ceiling hoist. The NDIS will pay for the track, the motor, which is effectively the hoist motor, and the sling. They'll pay for some training. They'll pay for the maintenance. Where it gets interesting is they won't pay for the installation. So there's an expectation the SDA provider would provide some resources to assist with the physical installation of it. But pretty much everything from the bolts into the supports in the ceiling and below is provided by the NDIS. Years ago, there was a huge arguments around that because different regions had different approaches. No, you have to pay for that. No, you pay for that. The SDA provider pays for it. But we actually do have some now precedent decisions, which I can point you to if you do need some assistance in that, where it is the NDIS's responsibility. Sure, no problem. Such a quiet bunch. And scare everyone off. I spoke at you for 2 hours, but hopefully you did get something out of today. Can the links of all the documents? Yes, I will. I will send some links to Ashley for all the various things around the rules and all the SDA related information. I'll send that. So when Ashley sends out the slides, you can send that along as well. Before everyone does go, I personally would like to thank Trent, Ashley, and the Access to Place team. As I mentioned, I've had a relationship with Access to Place for quite a number of years, and I'm very proud to be associated with an organisation that's doing such good things. So thank you for asking me to come along today and help present. And thank you everyone for your attention and all the best.
Yes, thanks a lot, Brent, and thanks once again to everyone participating on this Thursday morning on a warm November day.
Thank you.
Finally, so thanks a lot and enjoy the rest of the day. Yes.
Yeah, great. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.